Trying out something new here today, so we'll see how it goes.
Go a little bit further back. You're good.
Okay. All right. Well, today we're going to talk about the prodigal son. And we all kind of know the parable of the prodigal son. We know that it's sentiment. It's a message of the son's rebellion, his wasted life, and the father's love and his eventual return. It's a source of inspiration for many and a lesson throughout the centuries of how God's grace truly abounds. Today we're going to look at God, and not only that He accepts us as sinners, but that He earnestly seeks for our salvation. He earnestly wants us to return home like the prodigal son. The reason this parable was taught was because some were not so glad to see sinners come home. Like the Pharisees, I think many of us today struggle with the prodigal son's return. We think that this story, there's people that are too far gone, that God's grace cannot abound so greatly, and we find ourselves thinking that they are still the sinner and they can't turn back home. So, we need to have the same type of attitude towards the lost that God does. We need to look at them and long for them to return. God longs for us. He looks for us. He searches for us. He puts the effort towards the lost, so we, as Christians, should do the same. Jesus, in chapter 15 of Luke, where we'll be for this whole day, he talks about 3 types of sinners. If you go into chapter 15, there's 3 different parables. There's the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. So I think that he gives 3 examples of common sinners. The first is the lost sheep. The lost sheep is the sinner that is lost and doesn't know how to get back home. The second would be the lost coin. It's for those sinners that are lost and they don't even know that they're lost. They don't know that they're trapped by their sin. They don't know how to get home or even that they need to. And the third is the lost son, the parable, the prodigal son, who is lost and knows how to get home but reluctant. So we're going to look at the third type today. We're going to look at the prodigal son. We're going to start off in chapter 15, verse 11 to 13, the lost soul. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living." This is twofold. This first part is. The first part is that God loses man. Whenever we turn to our sin and we turn to live in the flesh, we turn from God, and this grieves God. God loved the world so much that He gave His only Son, that whoever believed in Him shall not perish but have eternal life. That's how much Christ loves us. And when we leave, it hurts Christ. Christ wants us to be with Him. He wants us to live with Him. And when we turn away, it grieves Him. The second fold is we lose God. And we don't know how much that hurts us. I think so often when we live in the flesh and we live for self-will, we don't realize the damage we're doing to ourselves. So the first thing is, the son was lost and gave in to self-will. Because of self-will, the son desired to go to this far-off country. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to eat, drink, and be merry. The things of the world look so pleasing. And it's easy to be like the son, to leave home, to go towards the world. It's easy because the world says it's so pleasurable, it's so great, it's so easy to slip into. Self-will causes many today to waste their lives on worldly things. We focus on flesh instead of the spirit. We think that we know what's best. Like a child, whenever I was younger, my parents, I say this a lot, they were not very smart. But as I've gotten older, they seem much more wise. And I think that's because I've given into the flesh. I've been in the world, and I've realized that the things they told me were to protect me, to keep me safe. The pleasures that I saw for self-will were not worth it in the end. I came home, and I realized the wisdom that my parents had. It sometimes takes us to go to the far-off country to realize how good we have it back home. We have to remember, because of self-will, the son made these demands on his father. And we look at Deuteronomy 21:17. It talks about the splitting of wealth. It says that the oldest son should receive a double portion. So in this parable, the younger son would have received 1/3 of the father's inheritance. It's pretty substantial. The younger son made these demands, which is disrespectful, but the father gave in to what he asked. We must be careful what we ask for sometimes Christ will give it to us. We think that we know what's best, and eventually sometimes our parents in love will sometimes give us what they know isn't the best for us. Christ will give us what we want sometimes, but we need to be careful what we ask for. The sons, a sober reminder that self-will separates us from Christ. When we give in to self, we give in to flesh, we create a wall that separates us from Christ. So we give in, we go on to the grief of the son. We go into Luke 14-16. So after he had spent everything, there was a famine, a severe famine in the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. This is a sign that says there are consequences for our actions. There are consequences for our sin. Famine always follows a life of sin. We need to be careful how we live. You reap what you sow. Living in sin sows sinful consequences. He lived like that. There are things that happen. Now, one thing that I thought was very intriguing to me was that what had this self-will taken from the son? We so often don't look at what the price he paid for this rebellion. He lost his dignity. He lost respect, his self-respect. He lost the good name, his purity, his conscience, and his happy home. The price for giving into the flesh is much higher than we think. There are high consequences for this. Now, another thing that I thought was interesting was whenever he got to his time of need, like most of us do when we give into the flesh, instead of returning home immediately, he stayed in the far-off country and sought help there. So often, whenever we fall into that sin and we finally hit that low, instead of coming to Christ or coming back home, we look for help elsewhere. Because I think some of it is that we are embarrassed of what we have done. I think part of it is that we're ashamed and we're unwilling to go home and say, I have sinned. We so often think we can still fix it by ourselves when we get to that low. And I think that that's one of the worst things that we can do. Instead of going to Christ at that moment, we try to fix it, and we try to fix it, and we try to fix it, and we realize it's not going to be fixed through ourselves, but only through Christ. And that's where I think the son is a very good example, because he stayed in the country, but no one gave him anything. He couldn't fix it alone. In Peter, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, his divine power is giving us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. If we turn to Christ, he will take care of us. We have to try to know that he is our opportunity to fix our problems. That when we hit that low, we should turn back to Christ immediately instead of trying to fix it ourselves. This is a vivid reminder that sin has consequence. As we enter in, we go to the journey back home. We see verse 17 to 20. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against you, and I have sinned against heaven. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So we got up and went home. Why is it always in our lives that we have to hit that rock bottom? We have to hit the low of lows, that we are almost starving before we turn to Christ. It seems like this is a repeated thing. I see this very often, even in my own life. Whenever I get to where I'm at the bottom of the barrel, it almost takes me to the bottom of the barrel before I come to Christ. I don't pray preemptively, I guess. I don't think about coming to Christ before the problem is so great. I wait till I'm starving. We should learn from this. Don't wait till we're starving to come to Christ. Don't wait till we have the weight of the world on our shoulders. We can come to the Father. We can come to Him as His children, and He wants us. He opens His arms to us and loves us. We just have to come to Him. We must look honestly at ourselves. He remembered home and what he'd left and wanted to return back to it. He realized what he had given up. He admitted that he had sinned. 3 of the hardest words for us to say sometimes whenever we come to Christ is, I have sinned. I have failed you. This is where I have been wrong. A lot of times we try to justify our sin, and we try to justify different situations that we're in, and instead of saying that, God, this is my fault, please forgive me, and coming back to Him that way, we say, well, I did this because, da-da-da-da. We don't just admit that we sinned and we'd failed. We don't just admit and come home and say, God, forgive me, show me that grace that I don't deserve. He realized his unworthiness. Now, I think that the sin and the thing and the journey that he went through showed him how much he needed his Father. Sometimes our sin shows us how much we need God. Whenever we find out how low we hit and we find ourselves in those situations that we are at the bottom, that we don't know how to get out, that our only option is Christ, when we turn to Him, He will take care of us. And sometimes when we hit that, God shows us that that's why we need Him. Because we can't make it through this life alone. We need God. Now, the son turned and took action. It's one thing to say I'm at the bottom. It's one thing to say I've sinned. It's one thing to be there. But you have to have action that follows. He had to come home. We have to say to Christ. We have to come to Christ and say, I am a sinner. We simply thinking about it does not get the job done. You must go home. If he had stayed in that land and said, man, God would have taken care of me, my father would have taken care of me if I had just gone home, but stayed in the land, it didn't get him out of the situation. We can say that we're in the sin and that we have a problem, but until we admit that we have a problem and turn to Christ and go to Christ, we can't get out of the situation. This sin is a wonderful reminder that we can come back, but we have to choose to come back. The joy of the restitution, the joy of coming home. Verses 20 to 24. So he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found. So they began to celebrate. Christ wants us to return. He loves us, and he will meet us halfway. The Father ran to the Son. God, when we turn to Him, will comfort us, will throw His arms around us and love us. It doesn't